Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back to the show. I want to share a story that begins in late April 1981. As I was going through the details of this specific case, it starts with a group of young men making a grim discovery along a rural road in Newton Township, located near Troy, Ohio. They found the body of a young woman lying in a ditch. She wore jeans, a turtleneck sweater, and a very distinctive tasseled buckskin poncho. I noticed right away in the reports that she was completely barefoot. She carried no identification on her person, making immediate identification impossible. Local police arrived at the scene, and an official investigation into the young woman's death began right away. An autopsy later revealed she had been brutally slain. She suffered severe blunt force trauma to her head and neck. After that attack, she was strangled, likely about 2 days before her body was found. The medical examiner noted a laceration on her liver, consistent with a violent assault. I found it quite surprising, just as the initial investigators did, that there were no signs of any illicit assault on the victim. The young woman appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s. She had reddish-brown hair, neatly braided into pigtails. She had very well cared-for teeth, indicating she likely enjoyed a good upbringing. These details painted a perplexing picture for the detectives working the case. The victim clearly didn't fit the typical profile of a transient person living on the streets. But yet no one knew who she was. With no name to call her, investigators and the media gave her a nickname based entirely on her clothing. The fringed suede poncho led to her being dubbed the Buckskin Girl. She quickly became one of the most famous Jane Doe cases in the country. From the very outset, Ohio authorities worked diligently to identify her. Because the body was found relatively soon after death, police took her fingerprints and dental records for comparison. Back in 1981, limited computer databases existed. Her prints matched no criminal records. Her dental information failed to match any known missing persons reports. Investigators released a composite sketch of her face to newspapers and television stations. They genuinely hoped someone would recognize her. These efforts generated around 200 tips in the weeks following the slaying. Unfortunately, none of those leads ever panned out. As time went on, the case grew cold. The authorities preserved all the physical evidence from the crime scene in remarkably good condition. This included her clothing along with samples of her blood. They held on to the hope that future technological advances might break the case wide open. In 2001, they generated a full DNA profile of the victim from the preserved blood sample. Then, in 2008, the Buckskin Girl was entered into the newly created National Missing and Unidentified Person System database. She became one of the very first cases included there. I read that in 2016, investigators performed isotope analysis on her hair and a detailed pollen analysis on her clothing. They aimed to learn exactly where she had been in the days and months before her death. These tests suggested intriguing details. She had likely spent quite a bit of time in the southwestern United States shortly before she died. Conversely, pollen found on her shirt and in her clothing pointed to extended time spent in the northeastern United States or Canada during the year prior to her death. This lined up with the theory that she was a transient or hitchhiker who traveled long distances across the country. The victim's clean, bare feet at the crime scene supported the idea that she hadn't walked to the dump site herself. Police believed she was slain elsewhere. Perhaps this happened indoors or inside a vehicle. The perpetrator likely left her body beside the Ohio road not long after her death. The major breakthrough finally came nearly 37 years after the act. By 2018, genetic genealogy had emerged as a new forensic method. This allowed investigators to identify victims or suspects by matching DNA to distant relatives through public genealogical databases. Miami County authorities partnered with a volunteer organization called the DNA Doe Project. Using the blood sample preserved from 1981, forensic scientists obtained a high-quality DNA profile. They uploaded it to a public genealogy database. In March 2018, within only a few hours of analysis, genealogists found a potential family connection. In early April 2018, the Miami Valley Regional Crime Laboratory confirmed the identification. They obtained DNA from a relative of the missing woman and compared it directly to the victim. In a press conference held on April 11, 2018, authorities officially announced that the Buckskin Girl had been identified as Marcia King. She was a 21-year-old woman from Arkansas. Marcia King had last been seen by her family back in 1980. She left home in Little Rock and traveled out of state. Because she was an adult and no one suspected she was in immediate danger, her family never filed an official missing persons report. Marcia King's identification completely changed how law enforcement handled these situations. She was one of the first unidentified victims ever identified through forensic genetic genealogy. This technique soon became famous for helping solve countless other cold cases. Marcia's family quietly hoped for her return for years. They finally had closure about her fate, even though it was a sad confirmation of her death. In Ohio, the generic Jane Doe headstone at her grave was replaced. The new marker bears Marcia's real name. A memorial service was held where local residents and officers paid their respects. The identification renewed energy in the homicide investigation. Knowing Marcia's identity gave detectives fresh leads about where she had been and who she associated with. Even with her identity known, the question of who ended her life remains unanswered. Before she was identified, investigators considered she might have been a teenage runaway or a hitchhiker traveling across multiple states. After her identification, I learned she often hitchhiked and maintained ties to multiple cities during her travels, like Pittsburgh and Louisville. Her well-kept appearance indicated she wasn't living homeless on the street. She likely had places to stay or people helping her along the way. I've read speculation that she may have been living out of a vehicle, like a van, when she met her untimely end. Internet sleuths speculate she may have been slain by an unknown boyfriend or male traveling partner. Others think she may have been involved in a traveling cult. Some circumstantial evidence supports this theory. Given the era and Marcia's red hair, detectives examined possible links to known serial perpetrators. In 1985, her case was briefly considered possibly related to the redhead slayings. This was a series of violent acts against red-haired young women across the United States. This connection was eventually ruled out. Evidence recovered from those crime scenes and other case specifics simply didn't match. Others wondered if Marcia might have been an early victim of an unidentified serial wrongdoer nicknamed Dr. No. This individual targeted women along Ohio highways in the 1980s. Despite these theories, no known suspect has ever been arrested or charged in Marcia King's slaying. There have been positive movements in the investigation. Since her identification, investigators pieced together some of her final movements. Marcia was reportedly seen in early April 1981 in Louisville, Kentucky. She possibly was involved with a traveling religious group or cult around the time of her death. Authorities still believe the most likely person responsible for Marcia's slaying is an unidentified boyfriend. Let me take you to March 14, 1998. 39-year-old Lenny Derrickson and his teenage son Jared were quietly beginning what seemed to be a perfectly typical day. They were working together on their family-owned dairy farm located in Strong City, Oklahoma. That specific morning, right around 9 a.m., an unknown stranger slowly drove a white Ford pickup truck straight up to their rural farmhouse. Lenny casually stepped outside to converse with the unidentified man. The ensuing conversation appeared entirely friendly from a distance. According to Jared's later accounts, his father did not seem the least bit alarmed or suspicious. After chatting for several minutes, Lenny briefly returned inside the house. He informed his son that the visitor was highly interested in viewing one of his prized stud horses. Lenny explained he planned to accompany the mysterious man on a trip. They were heading first to Elk City, Oklahoma. Afterward, they planned to cross state lines into Mobeetie, Texas, to inspect more horses. Lenny casually promised he would return to the farm by that same afternoon. He then departed the property, riding as a passenger alongside the stranger. They traveled in the man's white 1994 Ford F-150 pickup truck. This specific vehicle reportedly displayed New Mexico license plates. It also featured a highly distinctive yellow tag mounted on the front bumper. Jared stood and watched his father drive away down the dirt road. The teenager never imagined it would be the absolute last time he would ever see his dad alive. Later that exact same morning, approximately 2 full hours after Lenny had vanished down the driveway, a possible sighting was formally reported. A waitress working a shift at a local diner, situated just a few short miles away from the Derrickson property, contacted authorities. She claimed she observed Lenny sharing a breakfast meal with an unknown male companion. She specifically noted that the unidentified man commanded the vast majority of the conversation. Lenny, meanwhile, simply sat quietly, nursing a cup of black coffee and listening intently. The physical description of this talkative companion perfectly matched the stranger who had previously arrived at the farm. Lenny's immediate family, however, heavily doubted the credibility of the specific diner sighting. They pointed out that he had already consumed a full breakfast at home before the stranger arrived. They rigidly insisted he was not the type of man to eat a second breakfast in a single morning. I think about this logically, however. If a potential business associate requests a quick stop at a diner, accommodating them is simply good manners. Furthermore, according to the waitress's own statement, Lenny was merely drinking coffee. He was not actually consuming a massive second meal. This small detail perfectly aligns with the family's knowledge of his eating habits. Investigating detectives themselves remained deeply unsure if the quiet patron was truly Lenny Derrickson. It could have easily been a simple case of mistaken identity. Aside from this single unconfirmed report, absolutely no one else could recall seeing Lenny at any point on the day of his sudden disappearance. As soon as the realization hit that Lenny was truly missing, local authorities immediately launched a massive search effort. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation quickly joined the hunt. Detectives thoroughly swept the Derrickson property. They quickly discovered that Lenny had never actually arrived at the specific barn where his stud horses were securely kept. An exhaustive, meticulous investigation spanned the following days and stretched into weeks. The results were incredibly bleak. Police found absolutely no signs of a violent struggle. Zero physical evidence pointing toward foul play was uncovered. And, most distressingly, no body was ever located. Law enforcement possessed incredibly little information to build a cohesive case. They were forced to rely almost entirely upon the initial account provided by young Jared, along with the vague description of the unknown horse buyer. Naturally, this mysterious stranger instantly became the absolute central focus of the entire investigation. He was, after all, the last documented person seen in Lenny's company. A professional composite sketch of the suspect was carefully developed. It relied heavily on visual descriptions provided by both Jared and the local diner waitress. The resulting sketch detailed a white male. He stood approximately 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed roughly 210 pounds. His face featured a full, thick, reddish-brown beard. He was last seen wearing a black baseball cap, prominently displaying a No Fear logo. Despite massive public distribution of this sketch, the man has never been located. He has never been questioned by authorities. He officially remains simply a person of interest rather than a formally charged suspect. 6 long months following Lenny's baffling disappearance, the calendar turned to September 1998. A totally unexpected telephone call suddenly injected a tantalizing yet ultimately frustrating lead into the cold case. An anonymous male caller frantically contacted local police from a crowded bar situated in Amarillo, Texas. The man urgently claimed that the missing Lenny Darrickson was currently sitting inside that very establishment. The anonymous tipster provided a highly detailed physical description of the patron he believed was Lenny. Making the situation infinitely stranger, this patron was allegedly loudly boasting to other customers that he personally knew Lenny Darrickson. The frantic caller absolutely refused to provide his own identity to the dispatcher. He did, however, promise he would patiently wait at the bar until uniformed officers arrived on the scene. Police units immediately rushed to the remote Amarillo location. By the time they finally breached the doors, the trail was entirely cold. Both the anonymous tipster and the man he had confidently identified as Lenny were completely gone. The very next morning, a bartender who had worked the previous shift partially corroborated the bizarre story. The employee distinctly remembered the highly enthusiastic caller loudly proclaiming that Lenny was sitting in the bar. Investigating detectives found absolutely no logical reason to disbelieve the caller's incredible account. The bartender's supporting narrative added heavy credibility to the claim. Despite being an incredibly encouraging lead, it rapidly slammed into a total dead end. Neither Lenny nor the elusive anonymous caller could ever be tracked down for official verification. Law enforcement agencies doggedly continued to chase down various other scattered leads and anonymous tips over the ensuing years. Tragically, every single one ultimately fizzled out into nothingness. Over the intervening decades, several distinct theories have naturally emerged in an attempt to logically explain what exactly happened to Lenny Darrickson. One prominent theory suggests Lenny voluntarily abandoned his old world to secretly start a brand new life. Police investigators carefully note that without a body or a crime scene, they simply cannot rule this out. When I started looking into the life of Kurt McFall, I learned he entered the world on December 9, 1966. His birthplace was San Diego, California. Raised primarily within a quiet suburban environment, Kurt gained a reputation as a highly intelligent student at Clayton Valley High School. He was well liked by his peers. Acquaintances frequently described his personality as remarkably confident and, deeply caring. He eagerly participated in various extracurricular pursuits, dedicating his time to both the school newspaper and the official yearbook club. Academic subjects like advanced mathematics and complex sciences heavily occupied his interests. Beyond the traditional classroom setting, Kurt possessed a profound love for the great outdoors. He enthusiastically engaged in intense recreational activities. Swimming and scaling steep cliffs were among his favorite pastimes. A budding early fascination with the tabletop game Dungeons and Dragons eventually steered him toward joining the Society for Creative Anachronism. This specific organization was completely dedicated to the meticulous revival of medieval European customs. On Saturday, September 8, 1984, Kurt departed his family residence located in Concord, California. He steered his vehicle across the expanse of the Bay Bridge, heading directly into San Francisco. His stated itinerary involved spending the evening with a close acquaintance. He intended to drive back home by Sunday evening. The exact sequence of events that unfolded that dark night, however, remains shrouded in absolute uncertainty. Accounts provided by individuals intimately close to the teenager suggested Kurt had become increasingly entangled in a subculture, drastically removed from his conventional suburban upbringing. In addition to his active participation in the society, a strong interest in the occult had seemingly taken root. He allegedly joined a secluded group fundamentally focused on pagan religious practices. Long after the tragedy, a former high school companion disclosed a disturbing conversation. Kurt had reportedly spoken about his direct involvement with a satanic cult that actively experimented with dark magic. This confidant explained how Kurt felt hopelessly trapped by the organization's grip. He supposedly feared for his own physical safety if he ever attempted to permanently sever ties. Exactly 2 days following his unexplained disappearance, the calendar read Monday, September 10th, 1984. Two amateur birdwatchers were quietly exploring the rugged, treacherous cliffs situated at Land's End in San Francisco Bay. They stumbled upon a truly grim discovery. Lying on a remote, rocky beach far below the towering cliffs rested the bruised, half-naked remains of Kurt McFall. Essential articles of clothing were mysteriously absent from the body. He lacked a shirt. No shoes were found. His socks were entirely missing. The physical remains displayed multiple traumatic injuries, coupled with evidence of massive blood loss. The specific condition of the teenager's body deeply puzzled medical examiners. Despite the severe trauma clearly present, only minor surface abrasions were documented on various parts of his skin. Toxicology reports confirmed there was absolutely zero sign of illicit substances or alcohol in his biological system. Scattered around Kurt's abandoned vehicle were numerous empty beer bottles. This car was located, parked on a nearby golf course that provided a sweeping overlook of the Pacific Ocean. Investigating officers systematically noted several other highly unusual details present at the scene. Kurt's official driver's license was discovered resting on the floorboard. The keys to the vehicle had been casually discarded directly on the driver's seat. Perhaps most remarkably, an expensive, prized suit of armor, a piece he had specifically purchased for his medieval reenactment activities, was missing from the car's trunk. The presiding San Francisco coroner officially determined that the cause of death stemmed from multiple traumatic injuries and severe blood loss. The formal autopsy report did suggest the sustained injuries were largely consistent with a catastrophic fall from a great height. It carefully noted, however, that the precise mechanism causing those injuries could never be conclusively proven. Initial theories proposed by law enforcement suggested the fatality was simply a probable accident resulting from a late-night cliff-climbing excursion. Later on, the coroner himself went on record to remark that an intentional, malicious act remained a highly plausible cause. Despite this professional opinion, insufficient physical evidence existed to pursue any formal criminal charges. Consequently, the official manner of death was classified as strictly unknown. The case was left entirely unresolved. I noticed that one of the most intensely debated aspects surrounding this entire mystery involves a man named Gabriel Carrillo. This individual utilized the Welsh moniker Caradoc while serving in his capacity as a respected leader within a local neo-pagan group. Carrillo openly acknowledged befriending young Kurt. He permitted the teenager to spend nights resting at his private apartment. Regarding the specific night the death occurred, Carrillo recounted that Kurt had previously gone swimming in the frigid waters of Ocean Beach. Later on, at approximately 3 a.m., Kurt allegedly knocked on Carrillo's door. The teenager supposedly announced his immediate intention to return to the dark beach. Carrillo publicly theorized that Kurt might have simply taken far too many foolish risks during that turbulent night. Perhaps he slipped on the damp rocks, or maybe a powerful undertow dragged him out to sea. Carrillo rigidly maintained that the tragedy was nothing more than a horrible accident. Kurt's grieving father, along with several close companions, remained deeply suspicious of this specific narrative. As the decades have slowly passed, various distinct theories have been actively circulated to rationalize the mysterious demise of Kurt McFall. The primary theory remains the most straightforward. It suggests he suffered fatal injuries strictly due to an accidental plunge. The The cliffs at Land's End are notoriously treacherous. It remains entirely within the realm of logic that Kurt lost his footing while navigating the rocky terrain or attempting to enter the crashing surf. Proponents of this accidental theory heavily emphasize the complete lack of defensive wounds or trauma indicative of a physical altercation. An alternative, darker theory insists Kurt was deliberately pushed over the precipice. This implies direct foul play. This specific viewpoint has been heavily championed by the victim's father, Tom McFall. Tom held the steadfast belief that his son did not simply perish by sheer accident. He frequently argued that Kurt was an experienced climber, vastly more adept at safely traversing dangerous cliff environments. A core element to consider regarding this perspective is the sheer danger of the environment. Scaling jagged cliffs in the pitch black of night is extremely hazardous. Doing so during dark, stormy weather conditions exponentially increases the risk of a fatal error. Tom McFall also pointed toward the peculiar staging discovered near the abandoned vehicle. The sudden appearance of beer bottles and the baffling theft of the heavy armor suit indicated, to him, a deliberate tampering of the scene. I have to point out an essential fact often overlooked in the case files regarding those empty beer bottles. Family members and close acquaintances unanimously confirmed that Kurt absolutely did not consume alcohol. While a grieving parent's defense of a child's habits might sometimes be viewed with mild skepticism, the fact that his entire peer group completely corroborated this detail is undeniably a major point of interest. A third distinct explanation proposes the crime scene was systematically altered long after Kurt was already deceased. According to widespread discussions hosted on various true crime forums, some individuals theorized that local vagrants wandered by the area, or perhaps opportunistic scavengers stumbled upon the unlocked abandoned vehicle. These unknown parties might have unknowingly tampered with the surrounding scene. Proponents of this theory suggest the empty beer bottles, along with other discarded items, were simply left behind by these random passersby. They were not components of a sprawling occult conspiracy. This specific hypothesis attempts to bridge the gap between the accidental fall scenario and the bizarre clues found near the golf course. It argues the environment was unintentionally contaminated by completely unrelated individuals. Kurt's tragic case originally captured massive public attention primarily because it unfolded during the absolute peak of the 1980s satanic panic. Media outlets frequently presented the mystery in a wildly sensationalist manner. They constantly attempted to forcibly tie his unfortunate death into the broader, hysterical narratives dominating the evening news broadcasts at that time. The most plausible explanation, according to an objective review of the available evidence, points toward a tragic accident. The official autopsy revealed absolutely no signs of intoxicating substances. A horrific fall from the precarious, crumbling cliffs of Land's End seems to be a case of terrible misfortune rather than a calculated, deliberate homicide. Occult theories certainly offer a tempting cinematic narrative. The simplest explanation, however, frequently proves to be the most accurate. In this specific instance, an accidental plunge appears to be the most logical, reality-based scenario. Gabriel Carrillo was aggressively portrayed as a malicious Satanist by the press during that era. Deeper historical research, however, reveals he was actually a practicing Wiccan. His primary focus centered heavily on ancient Celtic traditions. Numerous historical accounts from individuals who personally knew him as Caradoc describe a different man entirely. These sources consistently report he was deeply invested in practicing white magic. He focused on manifesting positive, benevolent energy within the world. When examined through this grounded lens, his activities sound way less sinister. Media sensationalism, thoroughly intertwined with the overbearing overlay of the satanic panic, undoubtedly manipulated public perception of this enduring mystery. I want to shift my focus now to February 14, 1975. A couple driving down a rural farm road in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, discovered a truly tragic scene. They found a young man hanging from a tree. As I read through the original reports, the victim appeared to be a white male teenager. He was around 16 to 18 years old, with brown hair and eyes. At the base of the tree, investigators found a sealed glass jar. Inside the jar was a lengthy note addressed simply to Mom and Dad. In this letter, the teen expressed deep gratitude to his parents. He thanked them for giving him excellent advantages and privileges. However, he confessed to feeling like a false and empty vessel who never developed into a real person. He described a deep lifelong depression and a sense of detachment from life. The note even cited sociologist Emil Durkheim's writings on ending oneself. This specific detail really showed the boy's intellectual bent. In a very sad postscript, he implored authorities not to investigate his identity. He stated that chasing his name would only shatter his parents' peace. To quote the teenager directly, "Do not deprive them of the hope that their missing son will return. Simply cremate me as John Doe." This extremely unusual request set the tone for the entire mystery to come. Police found no identification with the body. They only recovered a comb and a laundry marker in his clothing. Investigators in 1975 made extensive efforts to learn his exact name. They took the boy's fingerprints and circulated them to police forces nationwide. No match ever turned up. The case received national media coverage. Over 300 parents of missing sons contacted the Plaquemines Parish Sheriff's Office or came in person to view the body. I find it heartbreaking that after a 4-month campaign failed to identify him, the police ended up closing their file. Tragically, no official case files remain today. The young man was ultimately interred in an unmarked grave in Gretna, Louisiana. Modern forensic efforts have been severely hampered by the complete lack of dental records or DNA samples. Because he was buried in an unmarked grave and the case file was lost, no one is entirely certain where he rests. Even if the case file hadn't been lost, I highly doubt it would have recorded the exact physical location of his burial. The circumstances in the eloquent note prompt many theories about what led this young person to take such a permanent action. I've read speculation that he might have been consumed by guilt for what he perceived as a serious personal wrongdoing. He may have been essentially punishing himself. Others believe he could have been struggling with his identity in an unaccepting era. This inner conflict could have contributed to his deep despair. Beyond motive, a major question remains. Who was this young man? Because no local missing person matched his description, internet sleuths have looked much farther afield. One popular theory is that this John Doe might have been Bayard William Couzens. He was a 22-year-old from Virginia. Couzens disappeared in early February 1975. He left his family a note telling them not to worry about him. Couzens was tall and slender, with very dark brown hair and a deep interest in philosophy. These details are strikingly similar to the Plaquemines victim. However, I must point out a few things. Couzens wore glasses, and none were found with the John Doe. He was also substantially older than the estimated age of the deceased. The difference between the lowest age estimate for the John Doe and Couzens' actual age is 6 full years. Those years between 16 and 22 are developmentally quite different. Couzens had a very distinctive cross-shaped scar on one of his fingers. The investigating police never noted this mark. Because the case file was lost, it may well be that initial investigators already ruled out Couzens. After all, they interviewed approximately 300 parents. Given that Bayard went missing around the same time the Doe was discovered, his parents may have been among those 300 interviewed. News didn't travel with modern speed back then, but this story absolutely made national headlines. Parents of missing children at the time likely glued themselves to news updates as much as possible in 1975. People who believe this theory suggest Bayard may have traveled over 1,000 miles to Louisiana to end his life anonymously. This aligns directly with the Doe's expressed wish to spare his parents the pain of discovering his body. He wanted to keep their false hope of a positive resolution alive. This idea remains completely unconfirmed. Internet sleuths work with even more incomplete datasets than official authorities do. I want you to picture being out late at night. You are standing alone after a gathering in the city. The air is freezing cold. The streets are completely deserted. Getting home as rapidly as possible becomes your only priority. So you open the Uber application and request a ride. After a brief wait of 1 or 2 minutes, a driver officially accepts the request. And then, well, a truly unsettling image appears on your screen to reveal the person coming to pick you up. I remember reading about how back in the year 2016, Chinese social media became absolutely inundated with screenshots from users of Uber China. They all reported the exact same bizarre occurrence after requesting a ride. Instead of viewing a standard profile picture of an average driver, passengers found themselves matched with someone resembling a corpse. These profiles featured hollow eyes, a completely vacant expression. Some displayed facial features that were unnaturally stretched out, while others looked like horrors dragged directly from the uncanny valley. Or, I suppose, a catalog of botched plastic surgeries. Images spread across the Weibo platform at an incredible speed. Users naturally wondered if the network had suffered a massive hacking event, or maybe some software glitch caused these grotesque distortions. A faction of the public began to claim these drivers were subjects of a coordinated psychological experiment, one supposedly orchestrated by the government itself. Others genuinely believed they were dealing with paranormal entities that had never actually walked the earth. The media eventually branded these strange accounts as ghost drivers. When I dug into the actual reality of the situation, it turned out to be decidedly less dramatic, yet I found it a lot more fascinating. At that specific time, the company enforced a cancellation policy, where passengers terminating a ride after a short grace period were charged a minor penalty fee. This money went directly into the driver's pocket. Individually, the cost was merely a few yuan, that is, barely enough currency to purchase a standard bottle of water. Drivers operating across the entire country, however, recognized the system as an easy opportunity to essentially print money. All a driver had to do was accept an incoming ride request and somehow persuade the waiting passenger to cancel the trip. What better method to force a cancellation than by introducing oneself as a possessed mannequin? I can see why the scammers banked on a very specific reaction. Customers would open the app. They would see a haunted waxwork assigned to collect them. The passenger would then decide they wanted absolutely no involvement with that particular journey and immediately hit cancel. This psychological tactic proved surprisingly effective. It worked particularly well against individuals traveling alone during the late hours of the night. These fraudulent drivers did not need to physically show up at any location. They never had to interact with the passenger. They simply collected the cancellation penalty and patiently waited for the next victim. Over the duration of a single night, those admittedly tiny fees accumulated into a massive payout. But what happened if a passenger was not adequately frightened into canceling the ride? Well, the scammers possessed another clever trick. Following the acceptance of a ride request, multiple victims reported observing their designated vehicle moving on the in-app map. It would appear to steadily approach their exact location. Suddenly, the digital car would drive straight past the passenger without ever slowing down. Mere moments later, the trip would be officially marked as completed. Alternatively, the driver would cancel the trip themselves after submitting a false claim that the customer was absent from the agreed meeting point. Other frustrated users described watching the GPS icon remain completely stationary for extended durations. Then it would abruptly jump all the way across the city. In certain extreme cases, I read that the driver's geographical location appeared to shoot directly through solid buildings, ultimately ending up floating in the dead center of a lake. A few customers grew legitimately spooked by these impossible movements. Some jumped straight to paranormal conclusions. Actually, this erratic tracking was merely a symptom of location spoofing software being utilized to artificially simulate movement. Once again, providing legitimate transport was never the objective. Triggering the payment system to extract another small fee was the sole goal. A handful of chilling reports even emerged from users who alleged their ghost driver successfully picked them up. The driver then supposedly transported them to a remote, desolate area and forcibly evicted them from the vehicle. This was allegedly exacted as vengeance because the passenger refused to cancel the ride, thereby wasting the scammers' valuable time. Due to the massive scale of this fraudulent enterprise and the striking similarities found between the fake profiles, widespread suspicion pointed toward a shady, organized syndicate. Consensus leaned heavily away from independent individuals acting alone. Because of the intense online scrutiny surrounding this scam, the company was forced to take decisive action. The corporation publicly stated it had adopted a zero-tolerance policy against exploitative behavior. Affected passengers were promised full refunds. The company eventually purged thousands of fraudulent accounts from its system. New facial recognition protocols were implemented to randomly identify active drivers. The timing of this crisis, however, could not have been worse. Just a few short weeks before the ghost driver phenomenon breached the mainstream consciousness, Uber had formally agreed to sell its Chinese operations. The buyer was its most formidable rival, Didi Chuxing. This sale concluded an extraordinarily expensive, protracted battle for dominance over the country's ride-hailing market. Reports of these terrifying ghost drivers merely reinforced lingering public anxieties regarding the platform's overall safety during a highly turbulent corporate transition. Years down the line, this bizarre chapter of internet history would eventually reach Western audiences through viral TikTok videos. Next, I want to talk about a much more recent case that I've been reviewing. On December 13th, 2020, around 10:55 at night, Jason Landry left his apartment in San Marcos, Texas, intended to drive to his parents' home near Houston. By 11:24 that night, Landry reached the town of Luling. His phone data shows he stopped using Waze, a turn-by-turn navigation app. He then opened Snapchat, a popular multimedia messaging application. Instead of staying on the main highway, he continued straight through town onto a quiet, rural path known as Salt Flat Road. Sometime around midnight, investigators believe Landry's vehicle veered off the gravel road and crashed. In the early morning hours of December 14th, around 12, a passing volunteer firefighter discovered Landry's Nissan Altima wrecked along Salt Flat Road. The car's headlights were still on, and the keys remained right in the ignition. Jason was nowhere to be found. I reviewed the scene descriptions, which show his clothes, backpack, cell phone, and other personal belongings strewn around the crash site. There was no physical sign of him in the immediate area. One theory holds that Jason was injured or disoriented from the impact and wandered off on foot. The night was cold. If he was in shock or under the influence, he may have become confused and removed his clothing. This paradoxical behavior sometimes occurs in severe hypothermia cases. Searchers found only a tiny drop of blood at the scene and no indication of a physical struggle. It appears he survived the wreck with minor injuries and left the vehicle on his own. In this scenario, Landry might have gotten lost in the darkness and ultimately succumbed to the harsh elements. Some people speculate he may have been under the influence and actively fleeing from the crash site when he became lost. Another theory suggests that, despite a lack of evidence pointing to major physical injuries, he could have suffered a traumatic brain injury in the accident. This could have caused him to act disoriented, exhibit out-of-character behavior, and wander away from the scene. A third theory suggests third-party involvement in Jason's disappearance. Search dogs tracked Jason's scent from the crash site back toward Luling for about a quarter mile. Then the trail suddenly vanished. This clue raises the possibility that he got a ride or was picked up by an unknown individual at that spot. No direct physical evidence currently supports this exact scenario. Law enforcement launched an extensive search immediately after Jason's car was found. Caldwell County authorities and volunteer search teams scoured the surrounding terrain with tracking dogs. They found no trace of Landry beyond the belongings left at the crash site and that brief scent track. Investigators thoroughly analyzed the physical evidence. Examination of the wreck indicated a single-car accident with no sign of another vehicle involved. As I look at the calendar now in February 2025, Jason Landry remains missing, and his case continues to perplex investigators. I will never forget hearing about the morning of August 9th, 2018. It brought a devastating tragedy to a family. 63-year-old Susan Rainwater was quietly cycling alone. She traveled along an isolated stretch of road winding through rural Washington state. The location was roughly 60 miles straight south of the city of Seattle. Without warning, she was violently struck and subsequently killed by a speeding vehicle. The driver of the automobile never bothered to apply the brakes. They never stopped to check on the victim. They certainly never contacted emergency services to report the fatal collision. Several long hours would pass before a random passerby finally noticed Susan's mangled bicycle, discarded in a muddy ditch. Her lifeless body was eventually discovered, lying hundreds of feet away from the initial point of impact. Investigating officers initially possessed remarkably little physical evidence to build a case. Absolutely no eyewitnesses were present to observe the fleeing driver's face or record a license plate number. Useful CCTV footage was entirely non-existent in that remote rural area. The sole piece of physical evidence abandoned at the violent crime scene consisted of a single object. It was a jagged slab of black plastic. The fragment was roughly the size of a standard smartphone. The piece had violently snapped off the suspect's vehicle during the exact moment they collided with Susan. Lacking any immediate actionable leads, Washington State Patrol Trooper Jonah Baptiste made a highly unconventional decision. She opted to crowdsource the complex detective work. She carefully photographed the jagged plastic fragment. The image was subsequently uploaded to the internet, accompanied by a public plea asking if anyone could possibly identify its origin. By August 10th, the digital photograph found its way onto a specific subsection of Reddit known as "What is this thing?" This particular digital forum is dedicated to users submitting images of mysterious objects for the community to collectively identify. The post rapidly accumulated massive attention. Hundreds of eager users quickly flooded the comments section to offer their own personal suggestions. The vast majority of these replies amounted to little more than moderately educated guesses. I read through some of the responses. One user theorized it resembled a piece of standard trim found on the bottom rocker beneath a car door. Another assumed the fragment originated from the front end of a vehicle, guessing it was part of a bumper assembly located near a headlight wiper. A different commenter suggested it merely looked like cheap gray plastic painted black. They thought it perhaps served as a decorative license plate holder or similar cosmetic junk. Eventually, a respectable handful of users correctly identified the damaged chunk as originating from a vehicle's headlight bezel. Very few, however, were able to provide any concrete specifics. That is, until one particular user entered the chat. Operating under the crude username Jeff's Nuts, this individual firmly claimed the broken fragment was definitively part of a headlamp bezel. He traced it to a late 1980s Chevrolet pickup truck. More specifically, he confidently identified the part as belonging to a 1988 Chevrolet Silverado. To validate his incredibly precise claim, he uploaded detailed comparison photographs. These images clearly highlighted a small, highly distinctive notch molded directly into the plastic structure. A notch he insisted was entirely unique to that specific automotive design. I mean, the public desperately wanted to comprehend how anyone could possibly identify the exact make, specific model, and approximate manufacturing year of a fleeing vehicle from such a generic, ordinary-looking piece of broken plastic. According to his own explanation, Jeff had previously enjoyed a career working as an official state vehicle inspector operating in Maryland. A major component of his daily responsibilities involved executing mandatory headlamp inspections and precise alignments. Consequently, he had spent countless grueling hours staring directly at this exact mechanical part attached to these exact trucks. Having examined the identical component day after day for several consecutive years, he did not even have to consciously analyze the plastic fragment in the photograph. He simply recognized its shape on pure instinct. The exact right person, possessing the precise niche expertise required for this impossible task, just so happened to be casually scrolling through the website at the exact perfect moment, right? Law enforcement investigators desperately wanted to apprehend the perpetrator before they had adequate time to hide their tracks or repair their damaged vehicle. They took Jeff's online post extremely serious. Instead of hopelessly searching for virtually any damaged vehicle scattered across the entire Pacific Northwest region, they dramatically narrowed their focus. They concentrated their search efforts on a much smaller pool of late 1980s Chevrolet pickup trucks. When combined with an anonymous tip received by authorities shortly afterward, Jeff's lead ultimately helped detectives successfully locate the hidden vehicle. They quickly moved to arrest the primary suspect. A man named Jeremy Thomas Simon was taken into police custody. During interrogation, Simon offered a hollow explanation. He claimed that on the tragic morning of the incident, he had simply fallen asleep while behind the steering wheel. He stated he genuinely believed he had merely struck a roadside mailbox. He admitted to fleeing the scene only after noticing the twisted wreckage of the bicycle. According to his official statement, he fled because he did not want to see a dead body. In January of the year 2019, Simon officially pleaded guilty to charges of vehicular homicide. Additional charges included hit and run, alongside the illegal possession of heroin. The actual reason behind his sudden bout of exhaustion behind the wheel was no longer a mystery. As a direct result of a negotiated plea agreement, a judge sentenced him to just 4.5 years in the system. Half of this mandated time was to be served inside a state prison facility. The remaining half was to be completed on supervised probation. Virtually overnight, the user known as Jeff became a certified internet legend. Global news outlets eagerly reported the sensational story that an online forum had successfully solved a fatal hit and run. Far more important to Jeff than accumulating meaningless internet karma, however, was a much deeper realization. He had directly assisted Susan's grieving family in finding some small semblance of actual justice and closure. In a subsequent interview provided to the media, he admitted he did not fully comprehend the immense seriousness of his contribution until several hours after publishing the initial post. He explained that it was not until he read a private message sent from a friend of the deceased that reality set in. The message detailed exactly how utterly distraught the victim's family was. They profusely thanked him for his invaluable assistance. Only then did he realize the real-world impact of his digital actions. A human being was dead. The perpetrator would have likely evaded justice entirely. The sheer randomness of someone posting the link, combined with his presence online at that exact millisecond, completely changed the course of the investigation. It is remarkably easy to dismiss obscure, hyper-specific knowledge as nothing more than useless trivia, the type of information you might occasionally pull out at a local pub quiz night to impress friends. Yet, every so often, a person's oddly specific life experience turns out to be exactly the key an impossible investigation desperately requires. Finally, might I tell you about a case from 1989 that really caught my attention. 23-year-old Adam Hecht, the son of a prominent Hollywood film producer, mysteriously vanished from Beverly Hills. He was last seen on June 7, 1989. He drove away from his home in a rented car while his personal vehicle was undergoing repairs in a local shop. Adam Hecht grew up in a wealthy Beverly Hills family with very close ties to Hollywood royalty. His father, Harold Hecht, was a highly acclaimed movie producer. His filmography stands as a major legacy in cinema history. Adam, then in his early 20s, worked as a tennis instructor. In early 1989, Adam befriended a homeless man known only as Tony. Adam shocked his family by inviting Tony to live inside his apartment. Adam had grown deeply disillusioned with his privileged lifestyle. Under Tony's influence, he developed a growing interest in meditation and mysticism. Soon, Adam was spending nights among the local homeless population. This brought immediate shock and deep concern to his wealthy friends and family. By June 1989, Adam's loved ones were growing increasingly worried. On June 7th, he drove off in a rental car and never returned. After several days with zero contact, his family reported him missing to the Beverly Hills Police Department. When Adam's brother went to check the apartment, Tony was there alone. He could offer no explanation for Adam's whereabouts. Police questioned Tony. He insisted he knew nothing about what had happened. He simply maintained that Adam was nowhere to be found. A few weeks later, police discovered Adam's rental car abandoned on a Beverly Hills street. It had accumulated multiple parking tickets on the windshield. The keys remained right in the ignition. Inside sat Adam's wallet, driver's license, cash, and credit cards. There was not a single clue regarding his ultimate fate. Searchers have never found any further trace of Adam, despite extensive efforts. With no physical evidence pointing to a violent crime, police could only treat the case as a missing person matter rather than a homicide. Adam's family insisted he would never leave voluntarily. His brother emphasized that vanishing without a word was completely out of character for him. With no solid leads to follow, the case eventually went cold. It officially remains open today, pending any new information. I've read two main theories regarding what happened to Adam Hecht. One theory suggests he left voluntarily to start a completely new life. Disillusioned with his privileged upbringing, Adam may have deliberately vanished to live among the homeless population. He might have wanted to pursue a deeper spiritual path. His keen interest in meditation and his willingness to abandon a wallet filled with cash lend credence to this idea. People studying the case suggest that leaving his keys in the ignition and his wallet untouched served as a conscious symbolic gesture. He was shedding his life of easy material wealth. Even police acknowledged the other possibility that Adam simply decided never to return. The other theory proposes that Adam met with foul play. His family suspects that Tony or another individual may have harmed him. Tony's odd behavior and a cryptic remark he made later fueled this suspicion. Roughly 1 year after the disappearance, one of Adam's family members encountered Tony. They asked directly if he knew anything. Tony replied that if the family member stayed on the streets long enough, he would find out what happened to Adam. Some interpreted this statement to mean that Adam was slain by someone among the homeless community he had joined. Others believe it indicated that Adam was alive and well, living on the streets and completely rejecting his privileged past. Without contact or new evidence for decades, determining Adam's exact fate remains elusive. Observers and investigators consider foul play a strong possibility, given his sudden disappearance. No physical proof supports a fatal outcome, though. It remains possible that he suffered a mental break or entered a dissociative fugue state, leaving his past behind permanently.